all kinds of things. My area of study for my doctoral work is the Church Fathers. So I spent a lot of time on the Church Fathers. I'm actually getting to teach a couple courses on Augustine this semester, which is exciting. Then I also do a lot of work, especially in our graduate program, on ethics and teaching natural law, which is kind of Catholic, foundation of Catholic ethics. Then also things like medical ethics, sexual ethics, Catholic social teaching, and all that good stuff. And so I really enjoy those classes and those discussions. I just started my graduate course on medical and sexual ethics just this last week. So those are always some interesting discussions. And so when Dusty asked me if I'd be interested in doing this, I said sure, because it's the thing, even though I study early church fathers, the discussions around ethics are often the most interesting. And usually the problem is trying to manage to wrap it up because people have so much they want to say about it. So last time, if you were here, we talked a little bit about natural law, right, and what it is, and kind of what the ethical system that the Catholic Church uses is, and what it's based on, and how it differs from other ethical systems, right? And so we kind of went through that and talked about when you kind of really boil it down, natural law is kind of rooted in the nature of things, right? So it's looking at the nature of the person, the nature of the world around us, and then trying to act in a way that kind of fits the way things are made and is going to lead to their fulfillment, to them reaching their proper end, to use kind of the more technical language, right? So I think I probably used an analogy, something like, I often talk about like a tomato plant, right? How do you know what's a good action as somebody who's growing a tomato? Well, right, you have to know the nature of tomato plants, and then you do things that are going to promote the healthy growth of that plant and the production of an ample supply of tomatoes, right? So those actions that tend towards that are good, proper water, proper sun, all of that. Things that tend to inhibit the flourishing of the tomato plant are going to be bad, right? So drought or frost or, you know, the dog digging it up, right? Those are going to be bad actions, right? And so that on obviously a more complicated scale, human beings are similar, right? That we can study human nature, we can look at what leads to flourishing, successful living, and the actions that promote that are good, and the actions that work against that are bad, right? So an obvious example would be, say, adultery, right? That when you look at the nature of the human person, adultery tends to work against the flourishing of the person. It brings in all kinds of conflict and chaos and kind of the root cause of most Matlock episodes, where somebody gets killed, right? So, but there's something to that, right? That we can look at the way human beings work. We can look across cultures, we can look across history and see, hey, this kind of action is not good for people, right? So that's basically, in a nutshell, kind of what natural law is about. It's about figuring out what kind of a being a human person is, what's the proper goal for a human person, and then acting in a way that's going to promote that, right? So that's kind of what we talked about a good bit last time. And then we talked about, right, that there's, that's the fundamental explanation of why certain things are right or wrong. We also talked a little bit about moral norms, right? That is, laws or, wow. So this would be, for example, this is a non-flourishing marker, yeah. Alright, something else. So a moral norm is like a law, right? So it's something along the lines of, I don't know, it's been a long time since I successfully grew a tomato. But let's say, give your tomato, 2 inches of water a week or whatever, probably more than that. But right, there are these handy guides for how to act properly. So the most famous example of moral norms, right, would be something like the 10 Commandments. Right, so thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. Those are moral norms.
Now, we talked quite a bit about the 10 Commandments the last time.
Mm-hmm.
We never mentioned the Beatitudes.
Yeah. So the Beatitudes, would also be moral norms, right? Be a peacemaker.
That's one of those who mourn.
Mourn.
The pure of heart.
Yep. So now one of the things about natural law that this highlights, right, is that in natural law there can kind of be 2 ways of doing it, right? And so the whole point is to get from what a human person is to what a human person ought to be, right? That's our ultimate goal. One of the advantages of natural law is that it is something that we can presumably get any reasonable person to agree with. Right now, in practice, it turns out to be very difficult at times, but you don't have to have a particular religious belief to accept the arguments of natural law, right? It boils down to what leads to good, flourishing lives that we can observe, right? So when we are arguing for certain goals, certain ways of acting, there are going to be some places where a full Christian ethic is going to go beyond what would just be required on a natural level, right? So you can have a naturally good life, right? So this would be a life, and we probably all know people like this in real life or read stories of somebody who's really living well, somebody who's healthy, somebody who has good relationships, who does meaningful work, who has some time for leisure, right? All of these things that would make up a good natural life, right? So in Aristotle, not a Christian, would talk about that kind of a life. That's our goal. Now, when you bring in Christian belief, we get kind of, our goal gets pushed further, right? Our goal gets pushed from not just flourishing in this life. Our ultimate goal is then the beatific vision, right? Or union with God in eternity, right? So there are going to be some cases, so like everyone would agree, presumably if you could argue it through properly.
Well, you say everybody agrees, but it seems like half of this country thinks abortion is okay.
That's true, but I think, so I wouldn't, obviously I don't mean everyone agrees with the fullness of natural law. I would say it's possible to reason your way to the conclusion that you should commit abortion without religious belief, right? So that's the way Catholic ethics would present it, right? Is you don't have to be Catholic or accept the Bible to be able to understand, if you're thinking clearly, that we ought not to have abortion. Now, some of the Beatitudes might fall into the realm of things where the goal is a supernatural happiness and not a natural happiness, right? So there are going to be some things that we do, say as Catholics, that you wouldn't necessarily be able to convince somebody who's not a religious believer to accept, right? Turn the other cheek, we could argue about it, but ultimately I think it doesn't make a lot of sense in purely natural terms, right? That natural law would say you can use force in self-defense. Turning the other cheek is kind of a supernaturally motivated sacrifice of what you would naturally be able to do in defending yourself. So the Beatitudes, I think some of them would fall into that category of things that you do have to have belief in an afterlife in order to make those kinds of sacrifices. It's kind of going above and beyond strictly what's right and wrong, and like sacrificing your rights for the goal of heaven, if That makes sense?
That makes sense. What's the difference between supernatural happiness and natural happiness?
Well, natural happiness, right? We can all. Oh dear. We'll go get a paper towel later. Dusty's not in here, but the video's on. I ought to tell Dusty that I got his seat wet. We will tell him.
Is that a supernatural thing?
No, that's a requirement for everybody. I'm way over here. So, where were we at? Oh,
Supernatural happiness versus.
yeah. I mean, natural happiness, again, I think we can reach some agreement about it, right? So even if you look at secular stories and philosophy, most philosophers, even very non-religious ones, are going to tell you getting as much money as possible isn't actually going to make you happy, right? That we can agree on the idea that greed is contrary to true human happiness, whether or not we believe in religion. Most philosophers or secular stories are going to tell you lying or being unfaithful to your spouse is not actually going to make you happy. And so there are a lot of things that we could put together to build up a concept of what a natural happiness is. We can come back to that. So we've got these moral norms. Right now, again, one of the ways that Catholic ethics is different from, say, many Protestant ethics, right, is so when we look at the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments from a Catholic perspective, they don't make those things wrong, right? It's not because God says don't commit adultery, don't kill, don't bear false witness, that those things are wrong. Those things are wrong by the nature of the acts and by the nature of the human person. God gives us the Ten Commandments in order to clarify things for us, right? Because people are sinful and people are busy and people like to lie to themselves about what they really ought to do. And so we get, in natural law terms, this is called divine law. We get, divine law is reveal the law. So God will reveal some things to us that we couldn't know on our own. For example, the truths of the incarnation, right? You can't come to that on your own. Or some of our particular religious obligations, like receiving the sacraments. That's not something you reason to naturally. But then also parts of divine law are just a re-emphasizing of what we could know through reason. Don't lie, don't steal, don't kill innocent people. Right? So the Ten Commandments are kind of God explaining things more clearly for us, perhaps than we might have figured out on our own. The other thing, right, when we talk about the Ten Commandments, that gets a little tricky is that sometimes there are more complicated cases that make it hard to figure out how to follow this commandment or if you ought to, right? So, for example, thou shalt not steal, right? It's a handy rule, right? And in 99% of cases, thou shalt not steal. Right? Well, and the philosophers love to do this. This is basically what you do all day if you study ethics as a philosopher. Well, what about, and then you come up with some crazy scenario, right? So, well, let's imagine, right, a world in which there's a famine, and people are starving, and you've got Scrooge McDuck with his warehouse full of bread that he is just charging hugely exorbitant prices for, right? And so he's sitting in there gleefully counting his money as he watches people starve to death out his window, right? And, what should we do, right? Thou shalt not steal, okay, but can we take bread from Scrooge McDuck, right? And so there's some debate about this, but most natural law scholars would say taking the bread from Scrooge in this situation is not in fact stealing, right? So one of the things about moral norms is that moral norms are succinct and easy to remember ways of describing how we ought to act. They don't necessarily capture every possible situation, right? So it is true that thou shalt not steal, right? But what does it mean to steal? What does it mean to, what does that mean when I steal something?
From somebody who needs it. But this guy has so much, and the other ones are starving. Take some ones, don't become.
From a guy who,
Don't make it from the one with a warehouse full of bread, but don't make it routine.
yeah, so,
Next week they don't make any bread though, because they don't make any money, so everyone starves.
well, he still ought to
What if?
make bread for the good of everyone, right? Because part of Catholic teaching is that the universal destination of goods, that the goods of the physical world are destined for all people, right? So, but we'll get to that in December. So thou shalt not steal, right, is basically, as you were saying, means thou shalt not take something that someone has a moral claim to, that someone has a right to. So there can be situations where a person has a legal claim, say, to something, but they don't actually have a moral claim to it, right? So in situations like this, it is immoral to hoard bread while people are starving outside your door, right? You don't actually have a moral claim to that in that situation. Or thou shalt not lie, as often is translated, right? Well, what do you do when you're in Germany in 1940 and you have a family of Jewish refugees behind the false wall in your bedroom, and the Nazis come and knock on the door and say, do you know where any Jews are? Right? What do you say to them?
No.
Now, some theologians have argued that you have to always speak, accurately describe things. You have to speak in a way that is never intentionally deceptive. Most theologians and natural law thinkers would say that in that situation, you can say that. Now, why is that? Does that mean it's okay to lie in some situations?
Say that.
Well, we have to be careful, right? So this is, I'm glad we're having it, right? So you have to be careful. You can't consequentialism, right? Consequentialism we can't do, right? So there is a way of reasoning that says that's basically a fancy way of saying that ends justify the means, right? So consequentialism is a technical way of, it's the consequences of an act that determine whether it's right or wrong, right? So, for example, once we eventually get to talk about medical and sexual ethics, right, embryonic stem cell research, for example, is immoral even if it would save countless lives, right? Because intentionally harming innocent human life is always immoral, even if I could sacrifice one life to save 1 million, right? It would be wrong to intentionally kill that one innocent life. So we have to be careful and say lying to the Nazis is okay because of the consequences. What we would say in natural law is, thou shalt not lie. Thou shalt not lie. Another way of saying that, which we don't say because it'd be a lot harder for kids to memorize in Sunday school, is you should never intentionally mislead someone who has a reasonable expectation of the truth, which just doesn't roll off the tongue usually as well, right? So but what do I mean by that, right? You don't ever intentionally deceive someone who has a reasonable expectation that you will tell them the truth. Right? Now, a lot of times when we lie, what we all recognize as bad is we deceive someone because it's better for me, even if it's bad for them. Right? So I lie to you basically because I'm putting my good over yours. In the case of the Nazis, people who are actively looking to kill innocent people don't have a reasonable expectation of the truth. I'm not harming them by not telling them where the Jews are. And in fact, in a way, I'm actually helping them because I'm preventing them from committing more mortal sins, right? So it's actually to their benefit for me to not tell them. And I'm not putting my good over the good of another person, right? So this is also why, for example, I don't think it's wrong to bluff if you're playing poker, right? Because if we're sitting around a table holding cards and playing poker, nobody has a reasonable expectation that you're going to speak the truth. So when you say, wow, that's my fourth ace, right? People aren't going to believe you if they know anything about what poker is.
Actually, you do a harm if you tell the truth in poker.
There you go. Or you could be like my father-in-law and actually oddly win that way. So I don't know. Or, for example, when your aunt, God bless her, who is the worst cook on the planet, brings her casserole to Thanksgiving and says, "Oh, honey, what do you think of my casserole?" You come up with something creative that may not directly reveal your true thoughts about the casserole. Right? But it's not, right, so it is not our social convention of when you go to a party and you just offhand say to somebody, "Oh, what do you think of my casserole?" People don't really expect you to turn around. You know, actually, you were a little heavy on the salt, and I think you undercooked it. I'm not sure what this green stuff is here, right? People don't expect that. They expect you to say, "Oh, it was wonderful, thank you," and then you get on with your life.
Give me another one.
Now look, if the same aunt came to you and said, "I am meeting a very important person for my work, and I'm making dinner for them, and this is the casserole I'm making for them. Tell me honestly, should I serve this to them?" Then you are in a different situation. Then I think that person has a reasonable expectation of the truth because they made it clear to you they want an accurate appraisal of their casserole, and now you have to carefully try to explain to them, "I really think you might go with something else," right?
What happens if she gets mad? Because they get mad.
Well, that might be part of what you have. Sometimes there are consequences to doing what you want to do. But
So is this the definition of white lies?
no, it's right. And see, a lot of times, I'm always nervous about doing this because it can seem like, oh, well, you just kind of go with the flow. I think the important thing is what we're supposed to always do is you're trying to promote the real good of the other person you're interacting with, right? And you have to be honest with yourself. And we have to recognize that there's a tendency to fudge things in our favor, right? Our tendency is going to be to want to avoid the difficult choice, even if it's the right one. But you also don't want to go to the other extreme and follow a particular way of understanding the rules, even in complicated situations where following the rule isn't going to really promote the good of the other person.
Could you analyze when someone says someone gets killed and the other person says, well, they're buying billions of dollars of arms from us and creating millions of jobs and we need an ally in that part of the world, like a show?
Again, so one of the things, though, that we have to affirm is that we can't ever intentionally do something wrong to get a good outcome. So if I'm participating intentionally and knowingly in an immoral act because of some good goal that I want to get, I can't do that. Right? I can't justify it based on the consequences I'm making for it. So, to talk about this, right, there's a couple principles we need to talk about here. So, there's the principle of double effect. was the first one, right? So, and I actually have to get to what we're supposed to talk about today. So the principle of double effect, but you have to understand this in order to do medical ethics, right? Because it comes up in practically every medical ethics situation. Right, so principle of double effect is a way of working through situations where one action is going to have more than one outcome. And you're going to have an action that has a good outcome and a bad outcome, a good effect and a bad effect. How do we make moral judgments about those kinds of actions? Right? This is where the principle of double effect comes in, which stretches all the way back to Aquinas in some forms, but has been kind of refined over the centuries. So the principle of double effect has a number of criteria, and we have to meet all of them in order for the action to be good. Right? So the first one is your intention must be for the I put it in the wrong order. Act itself must not be immoral. All right. So usually, no, 1 and 2 are flipped. I got out of order. So the first thing is that the action itself can't be immoral, right? So if you are trying to talk about, what's an example of this? So when you have an ectopic pregnancy, right? So this is a situation where the embryo starts to develop within the fallopian tube instead of in the uterus, which is obviously not good because fallopian tubes aren't designed to accommodate that. And in certain situations, it can develop to the point where ultimately it ruptures and causes hemorrhaging, and you can actually, the mother can die as a result of this, right? So when ectopic pregnancy is diagnosed, well then what do we do with this? Right, so if you go to a non-Catholic hospital, what they will typically suggest is terminating the pregnancy, right? So especially if it's early on, they can even just do it through administering a drug, and the embryo is typically just reabsorbed by the body. So it doesn't actually, I think, require surgery if it's early enough. So what they would do is give you a drug that ends the pregnancy, right? From a Catholic ethical perspective, from natural law, you can't do that, right? Because the first step of double effect is the act itself can't be immoral, right? So intentionally ending an innocent human life is always immoral, right? It doesn't matter what the rest of the reasoning is. You can't intentionally harm an innocent human life, right? So from the very first step, we can't do that. Does that make sense? Okay. The next one is, again, in the proper order, our intention has to be for the good, right? So for example, given our theme for the class, this works, right? So if we're talking about hysterectomies, obviously there are different health conditions where a hysterectomy is medically necessary, right? So if someone has uterine cancer, for example, a hysterectomy is going to make sense. Right now, that has a good and a bad effect for a woman who's still of childbearing age, right? So the good effect is preserving the life of the woman. The bad effect is the loss of fertility, right? However, given the other things, which we'll talk about here in a minute, it can in fact obviously be the moral choice to go ahead and get the hysterectomy. Now, if you look statistically at the data from, say, Ireland in the mid-20th century, the rate of hysterectomies was much higher than you would expect given normal, healthy populations. Why is that? Well, it's because abortion and sterilization is illegal, hysterectomies are not. So basically, people are getting hysterectomies for the purpose of the infertility, right? And so you can't do that, right? You can't use a possible good effect of treating, say, some minor health problem as a sort of cover for actually intending the bad effect, the loss of fertility, right? So you can't, when you're acting in accordance with principle, though, like, you have to always be intending the good effect. You can't actually be aiming for what would be a bad effect, like the loss of innocent life or the loss of fertility or things like this. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. You can't get the good through the bad, right? So it can't be, you can't get your good effect through the bad effect. So if we go back to the example of the ectopic pregnancy, right? So what do you do in a Catholic hospital if a woman shows up with this condition? Now, this actually gets tossed out a lot of times in discussions of Catholic medical ethics as like, people like present it as the counterexample to Catholic ethics. So there is a Catholic response to this, right? So one thing is actually, last time I looked at the studies, it's been a year or two, but in the majority of cases, this actually resolves, right? That in the majority of cases, monitoring the situation is an appropriate approach. And in most cases, the pregnancy does not progress to the point where it actually threatens the life of the mother. So that would be the first step, right? Now, let's say it does continue. What do we do then, right? Well, this is a difficult situation, obviously. But what they do in Catholic hospitals typically is that they will remove the fallopian tube that the embryo is developing in. Now, what does that mean, right? Well, it obviously saves the life of the mother. It has the unintended bad effect of the unborn child is not going to survive this, right? So what is the difference between that and the direct abortion, right? Well, right, you can't get the good, the health of the mother, through the bad, through the death of the child. Because if you do that, say giving the drug, you are sort of indirectly intending the bad effect. You're causing the death of the child in order to preserve the health of the mother. When you remove the fallopian tube, it is not the death of the child that actually brings the health. It's the removal of the fallopian tube. Right? Now, again, I understand, for many of you, this seems like a very subtle distinction. And look, it is a very subtle distinction. But it is an important distinction, right? Because we never intentionally cause the death of an innocent person. We can carry out actions where the unintended death of an innocent person is going to be a result, but we actually have another goal in mind, right? So, for example, when women who are pregnant are diagnosed with aggressive cancer during pregnancy, you can use chemotherapy to treat the cancer, even if you know it will likely cause the death of the unborn child, right? That is you can pursue this good of preserving the life of the mother, even if you anticipate it's going to have this very bad effect, right? So the good or the good must be proportionate to the bad, right? So now look, you couldn't do a medical treatment for a nagging but not potentially life-threatening ailment that would likely cause the death of the unborn child, right? But if you are faced with a situation where the only way to save the life of the mother is through a treatment that's going to endanger the life of the child, you can morally choose to proceed with the treatment.
What happens if the mother decides to give her life in order to
You can morally do that too, right? So there are cases where women will forego the treatment in order to preserve the life of the unborn child, which is, so there's nothing immoral about risking your life to save another person's life. However, you also can perform actions that will save the life of one person, even if you know it's likely going to result in the unintended death of another person. Right? This happens in disaster situations, triage situations, military situations all the time, right? That you have to make. So you can never intentionally act in a way to bring about the death of the innocent person. But you can carry out acts aimed at another effect that have that as an unintended bad effect. And yes, it can seem kind of confusing and difficult, but there are situations in life that are
Hair
confusing,
splitting.
difficult.
I said it's like hair splitting almost.
It
Yeah.
can be, but it still is an important. Look, there are situations where we have to choose between two lives, right? And there's never going to be an easy and comfortable way to do that. But there's a real importance in Catholic ethics of drawing that line of we will never intentionally cause the death of an innocent, right? We can act in a way that's going to have that unintended effect. We can't intentionally cause it, right? Right? And so again, in the chemotherapy example, a lot of times what would happen at a non-Catholic hospital is they would give you a drug to terminate the pregnancy before you start the treatment, right? They won't do that at a Catholic hospital because you can't do that. You can't intentionally cause the death of the and again, these can seem like,
They can't do that without your permission.
no.
Right.
But this is, and again, it seems like a subtle distinction, and it is in some of these cases, but it's an important one, right? Because you have to draw that line of we're not going to intentionally cause innocent death. Because once you cross that line, even if we have situations where it seems very close to, once you cross that line, then you open the door to everything, right? To embryonic stem cell research, to abortion, to the euthanasia, the whole ball of wax. Right? So we have to draw that line, even though there are going to be cases where we will act in a way that appears similar in various respects, but we're going to insist on, we're never going to intentionally cause the death. And it's not an easy, and those are relatively rare, those cases where that has to happen, but they do get a lot of attention because these are the kinds of things where bishops will ultimately tell hospitals you can't call yourself Catholic anymore if you step over that line.
End-of-life decisions come into this too.
Yeah, they do too. So, when do I have until this?
3:25.
Okay. Yeah, we'll be fine. So that's principle of double effect. The other principle, which I'm forgetting now what situation it was, I thought we were getting into it, but I just want to go ahead and talk about it briefly. It's called the principle of legitimate cooperation. So the principle of legitimate cooperation is a principle to deal with cases where we are part of a larger entity, organization that is involved in immoral acts, right? So what do you do as a taxpayer, as an employee, as a citizen, as a customer maybe even, right? How do we evaluate our involvement in, so right, when we get arguments about whether or not you should buy Nike shoes, right? I'm not over there running a sweatshop telling people they can't go to the bathroom for 10 hours and not providing adequate fire exits because I'm afraid they'll run off with my shoes, right? But is the fact that I'm not there doing it mean that I have no moral involvement as a customer or as an investor or as somebody who works at Nike corporate headquarters? right? So how do we think through those sorts of situations? That's where this principle of legitimate cooperation comes in, right? So so the first level is called formal cooperation. Right? So formal cooperation means this entity is doing something wrong and I agree with it and support it, right? And obviously you can't do that, right? So if you are working for this company and you're like, yeah, you know, we should pay these people as little as we can possibly get away with because it's going to maximize my pension, tough for them, right? That would be formal cooperation, right? You are in agreement with the immoral action that is going on. Can't do that, right? So the more interesting level is what do you do in situations where you don't personally agree with what's going on, but you still have some involvement, right? So that we call this material cooperation. You are involved in it in some material way, but you think it's wrong, which again, we hear this all the time in politics, right? Well, personally, I don't agree with it, but.
Should I pay my taxes to build a wall?
There you go. Or any number of things. So the first level is called immediate material cooperation, right? And so again, the example I will use here is kind of like with abortion, right? So let's say I'm a nurse who works at a hospital, there's a shift shortage and they call me in and they want me to be there like assisting, handing the doctor scalpels and stuff during an abortion, right? Can I do this? Well, I don't personally agree with abortion, but can I go and hand the scalpels, right? No, right? So that would be immediate material cooperation, right? You are immediately involved in this immoral act that's going on, and you can't do that even if you disagree in your mind, right? So then there's medians. So what if you are a little bit further removed? What if you're the person who sets up the room, right? You're just a technician who lays out equipment and stuff. Can you do that, right? And again, the answer is no, right? That it's immoral to, even if you're not like directly there as the act is happening, if you are facilitating it in a material way that is fairly close, then you ought not to be in that situation. It's immoral. The last level is what's known as remote material cooperation. All right, so let's say I'm the heating and cooling technician at the hospital, and all I do is I just go around and take care of heaters and air conditioners. And I'm assigned to the wing that has nothing to do. I'm assigned to, you know, the dermatology wing, right? That's where I do all my heating and air conditioning work. I have only remote association with the abortion that's happening the other end of this mega hospital, right? What do you think about this situation? Moral or immoral? It depends, right? So in moral theology, well, I don't want to say that. It's not always it depends. In a lot of cases, though, the answer is it depends. It can be moral. It can be moral. However, the key is that you have a requirement to minimize or ideally eliminate your involvement as much as possible, right? So if a job opportunity opened up in the hospital across town that didn't do abortions, you ought to go there, right? Or if you could buy your shoes from a company that wasn't using forced labor in sweatshops, you ought to do that, right? Or right, so what about paying my taxes, right? It's not really feasible for us. Now, we could not pay our taxes, but then you go to prison and there's all this. So for most of us, it's not a possibility to not pay our taxes. So what we are called to do, though, is that doesn't give you a free pass. It means you ought to minimize your involvement as much as possible or work to eliminate the wrongdoing. So you, as a taxpayer, write to your representatives and say, stop doing this. You sign petitions. There are situations where we can't remove ourselves from the immoral actions being performed by an organization. That doesn't mean we're just going to pass. You ought to eliminate your involvement as much as possible, and if that's not possible, you should work to end the immoral action.
Take it further from that, you work in a factory where you make these instruments. Is that also immoral?
Well, I mean, again, it would depend. If you worked at a factory where they the product they made was a product that is only used in abortions, I think that would be pretty problematic in terms of, I think that would move you up out of remote cooperation. Now, if you work at a factory that makes scalpels, right, they're used for tons of things. I don't think that is immoral, right? And there's a lot of situations, right? And again, obviously, it'd be nice if, like, on the Vatican website, you could go and type in your situation, and like it would spit out the ding, moral or ding, right? These are just, all it is a framework for helping you think through situations, right? And so you do have to. There's going to be cases that are difficult. Like if you are, let's say I make guns at a factory, is that moral, right? Well, I think it can be. I have a gun. I occasionally shoot possums and raccoons that try to eat my chickens, and I'm okay with that, right? I don't hunt just because it seems boring, and the chickens are a lot easier to catch. But look, if I worked at a factory that made guns and we specialized in super cheap disposable handguns, right? That would be much more morally problematic, right? Because you know that the reason people are buying them is probably to commit crimes, right? And in that case, I think my involvement is closer than remote, if that.
How about our investment funds that are going to, especially those that are a little buried? I've actually made some changes when I found out. Do the best you can by making those changes. I mean, you know, that's kind of in that same tax day area, but we can do a little homework and figure that out.
Yeah, I mean, it is a complex issue. And we will come back to this more in the next class on social justice. One of the other basic principles of natural law is that you are only morally obligated to do what you can reasonably be expected to do, right? And so, when I do a whole course on Catholic social teaching, the response I typically get is like this blank stare of like, how can I possibly do anything, right? Because everything is terrible. And, you know, I'm going to spend all day driving around to different yurts getting, you know, handmade organic goods. But unfortunately, you're driving, so you're destroying the environment. So, right, so like, whoa, right, and then your head blows up.
Yeah.
So you just do the best you can to minimize your involvement with immoral things the best you can. So, yes, look, if you become aware of a situation, your company is putting a lot of your retirement into this particular fund, and this particular fund is focused on something that is clearly immoral, then I think, yeah, you make a change. Is it realistic for all of us to do this kind of analysis of every interaction we have on a day-to-day basis? No. Right? So, again, you have to strike this balance of trying to be reasonable in investigating these things and making good choices. But you also can't undermine spending time with your family, going to church, doing your job by, you know, tracing back every product you buy to its original source to make sure that there was nothing bad in the process. The other problem is, like say Walmart, right? Oh, how can you go to Walmart? Well, I'm no fan of Walmart, but the problem is, okay, if I'm not going to go to Walmart because they are knee-deep in all kinds of abuses of employees and environment and all that, where do you go, right? It's not clear to me that Kroger is, you know, obviously and exponentially morally superior to Walmart. I think it's basically the same thing. Target, probably not, right? So there are, you minimize your involvement as much as is possible.
How about Amazon?
Don't even.
Amazon.
I know, it's what are you gonna
Amazon, yeah.
do? So, all right. So we'll come back to these principles. I do want to talk.
Send my song.
I got 20 minutes. So we got 10 minutes for medical ethics and 10 minutes for sexual ethics. And we might spill over into next month because they're important issues. We talk about sexual ethics. Right, so the main thing I would say, right, again, given that I have such a limited time, I would think of it or talk about it in terms of what is it that leads to a flourishing, happy life, right? And so I'm in the middle of this with my grad students again, and one of the challenges, right, of all the areas I teach, I think I said this last time, but that's fine, say it again. The single hardest thing I have to deal with every semester is sexual ethics. In particular, same-sex relationships and transgender issues, right? And there is no harder topic to broach with, right? A 20-year-old, most of them are okay talking about the pros and cons of abortion, right? That you're not a bigot if you're opposed to abortion for most 20-year-olds that I deal with, even those who have no religion whatsoever. Same-sex marriage and transgender issues is much more charged, right? And it's much harder to get anywhere with.
I have something. How about two individuals who are living together? I'm not going to say marriage, as I say, but I don't mean it. Living together, and then they pay a married woman to have a child, and the child is being born at the end of this month, and they want to baptize the child. What do you think of that?
I would say that's going to be an interesting situation for the pastor.
Sounds like you have a specific case in mind.
Yeah, I mean, in the church you are, it's a challenging pastoral situation, right? You're not supposed to baptize children if there's no reasonable expectation that they will be raised in the faith. Now, as we all know, it can be very pastorally sensitive to sort out that line between what's a reasonable expectation that somebody will be raised in the faith, and if denying baptism is going to encourage them to get closer to the church, or if it's just going to, that is above my pay grade. So I would say, what I try to say with people is, and I think first of all, if any of you like Bishop Barron, right? So
Yes, I do.
Bishop Barron says he does everything he can to avoid talking about same-sex and transgender issues because it tends to cut off conversations, right? You want to build a foundation and relationship with people before you try to broach this. When you do try to broach it, I think the key is to focus on that the church's teaching on sexual ethics is meant for people to lead the most successful, flourishing lives possible, even if that requires sacrifices. I think leading with your cousin who's in the same-sex marriage is a sinner is often not helpful, right? It's often not going to promote dialogue. And that's just, I mean, that's not church teaching. That's just, in my experience, telling everybody that it's all a sin may be truth, but it may not be helpful, at least in some situations, for people who have no inclination to accept the church's teaching. Obviously, when we talk about sexual ethics from a Catholic perspective, there have to be two components to moral sexual acts, right? So sex is designed to be unitive and procreative. Right now, one of the things to be aware of is that it is relatively recently that these two were kind of seen as equal, right? So it's really Vatican II and then Humanae Vitae where we get this explicitly in official teaching, although the unitive part is there earlier. Really, it used to be it's the procreative end of sex, and this was kind of secondary. If you look at current church teaching, it's really these are the two proper ends of moral sexuality, right? So it has to be unitive, right? This has to be kind of the total gift of self to each other, right? So you are fully committed to and uniting with this other person. And it has to be procreative, right? And again, we don't have the time for this. We'll add another course sometime. We'll talk to Dusty about it. But, you know, for St. Augustine, for example, for him, you are violating this if you aren't intending specifically with that individual act for it to result in conception. Right? For Augustine, you have to be aiming purposely at conception from a particular encounter for it to be moral. Right? That is not what the church teaches today. Right? What the church teaches today is you have to act in a way that is open to the possibility of conception happening. Right? So that is, another way to put it is you aren't intentionally inhibiting the procreative aspect of sex. Right? So artificial contraception, right, is obviously the example here, that you are purposely intervening to eliminate the possibility of conception. But obviously you can have sex within a marriage even if you know it's probably not going to result in conception due to fertility cycles, or due to an existing pregnancy, or due to menopause, or due to the woman had a medically necessary hysterectomy, or whatever it might be, right? Those would still be procreative according to the church's teaching because you are open to the possibility. Biological facts of the two people's bodies may make that not likely to happen, but you are open to it. Does that make sense? Now again, for Augustine, no, right? So if she's already pregnant, that's 9 months of abstaining for Augustine.
Interesting from where he came from.
Yeah, there's a whole set of issues there. Right, so when we look at why, so one of the questions you get is like, why? Why does the church insist on this, right? And this is where I would go to our idea that marriage is a sacrament, that marriage is something that actually makes us participate more fully in the life of God, or something that actually makes us more like God. Right? That when we're united to Christ in the Eucharist, it actually makes us more like Christ. Right? And in marriage, we are actually made more like God. Right? When you look at the Trinity, this Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, it's this total giving of each person to the others and receiving that back, right? So there's this constant interchange between the persons of the Trinity, right? Which is life-giving, right? And in marriage, when we are open procreation, we are approximating that, right? And personally, for me, right, me getting married was easy because my wife is just really great. And if you're watching this on video, honey. So having kids, though, that was a whole other ballgame, right? And right, so my children forced me to be more like Christ on a regular basis, whether I want to or not, right? That I have to be self-sacrificial, right? And so why does the church insist on this, right? And I think that's a big part of why, right? One is we can look at the design of the person, right? And obviously there's a complementarity between men and women. But the fact that marital sex, following the church teaching, connects you to this larger web, right? And it results often in children that are going to make you more like God, whether you like it or not, I think is a big part of it too. Right, are there any questions or comments about that?
Yeah, I think just real briefly, we're going to do a whole session on Humanae Vitae next month, but I think a simple way to put it, to me, a close reading of Humanae Vitae, because as you mentioned, Dr. Papsdorf, a lot's been made in the last 50 years over the unitive side, but I think even in the language of Humanae Vitae, if you read between the lines, if I can use that phrase, it seems to me what Paul VI is saying is that the unitive aspect is praiseworthy because it maintains the possibility of future procreation. So in other words, it's not morally blameworthy to have intercourse even if it's in a perceived time of infertility, because, to make a long story short, then maybe you'll do it again later when you will be able to conceive. But I agree I agree with the consistency that you're presenting there. But it's interesting how that's kind of been broken apart in some people's minds.
We can't possibly do medical ethics, so we'll do that next time and with social justice, because we'll probably get that done.
When this business of two men getting together and two women together
Yeah.
started, where did they start? The Lord created man and woman. Where did they start?
Well, I mean, there have been same-sex acts and relationships as far back as you can go in history. I mean, the ancient Greeks are well aware of this, and predates them by quite a while.
Before the AD?
Oh yeah. I mean, it was part of Spartan military training. And yeah, that's the whole thing. So it does. I mean, it goes. Well, now the idea that the Greeks and Romans are well aware of this. Romans less accommodating in many cases than the Greeks, but still, the idea that it was equivalent to marriage is a modern phenomenon. Right? That's not. That idea doesn't have historical precedent. There certainly were same-sex acts historically. Right, and so again, the challenge here is how do we address same-sex relations? How do we address transgender relationships, right? And so it goes back to when we look at the person from a Catholic perspective, the person is body and soul together, right? And so the idea that your body can be wrong just doesn't fit with a Catholic conception of the human person, right? And
Yeah, I just seen something the other day on the internet about that.
yeah, it's called gender dysphoria, right?
Well, yeah, the can says peas, but inside is carrots, and it's not the carrot's fault.
Yeah. Now, so again, one of the things, right? So this is true both of transgender, right? The idea that your gender doesn't match your biological sex, or people who are attracted to the same sex, right? How do we respond to this as Catholics, right? And on some level, we have to say that we believe the body is just as much as what makes you who you are as the soul, right? You're not really, even this way of talking about it is borrowing stuff from Plato and Descartes that doesn't really fit the Christian sense. Aquinas and Aristotle, I think, get it better, right? So your soul is not like this separate thing that can, it's not like a Tom and Jerry cartoon where you die and, you know, Tom's body lays there and then this glowy Tom goes off somewhere, right? your soul is what gives your body its coherence and what makes it alive, right? It is the shape of the form of your body, right? So even when we exist in heaven after death, prior to the resurrection, God willing, we're in heaven and enjoying blessedness. But even if you read Aquinas, right, it's not like you're sad about it, but there's this anticipation, right? Because the soul is not completely at peace when it's separated from the body, because that union is so intimate, right? That your soul is designed, it is one thing that has been temporarily separated into parts, right? And in the resurrection, you will be fully who you've always been meant to be, right? And so that's what's behind a lot of the Catholic understanding of the importance of the body. Now, that is not to say that there aren't people who actually, so the church in official documents does acknowledge the possibility that there are people who have a neurological or biological tendency to be attracted to the same sex. There might well be people who have a predisposition to struggle with their gender, right? Having that inclination is not a sin, right? So it is not a sin to be attracted to the same sex. It does not make you a worse person, right? We all have different areas where we are particularly prone to act in a way that is contrary to God's plan, right? This is a particularly challenging situation, form of that, right? And so, so what again I try to emphasize in class, I have to teach this to people who aren't Catholic, so it's a little tough. What I would just say is we need to be as pastorally sensitive as Christian as we can be about this, and recognize the church's teaching is a huge challenge for some people, right? That it is designed at them leading the best, most flourishing life possible. But they're not a bad person for having the inclination. It's just going to be a particular challenge for them. You know, we all have it, right? It's not, I think, a worse sin than other sins, right? And even when Paul gives his list in Romans 1, we have that passage about people falling into sin, and then even the men and women stop being united with each other and unite with other men or other women. Even there, I think his point is, he's making a point about what sin is, that it's going contrary to God's plan. It's not the worst sin. The worst sin for Paul in Romans 1 is idolatry, right? That's the worst sin. Not that it's an okay sin, right? But I think a lot of Christians focus on it because it's easier for us, right? For me, taking a stand against homosexuality, that requires like zero sacrifice on my part, right?
Well, if your son comes up someday.
Then it's a lot closer to home. But I think a lot of Christians focus on homosexuality and not so much, say, on greed, because the greed might hit a lot closer to home, right? So, you know, I go to Clonmel, we're out in the country. I don't hear a lot of homilies about, you know, would Jesus drive a $70,000 truck? Now, I don't know, maybe he would, but those conversations can be very difficult. So I do think there are some Christians who focus on these things because it doesn't cost them anything. But again, it's really tough. Any other final questions? Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.